Elizabeth, a literary princess, and today we are doing a Fairy Tale Friday video. In this feature, I take a retelling of a fairy tale and I look at it against the different variations of the story across cultures and point out what the author has used, what they have chosen not to use, and how it works as a retelling. Today, we are looking at The Shadow in the Glass by JJA Harwood. This is a retelling of Cinderella with a gothic twist. Now, I usually give a kind of summary and history of the fairy tale. I'm not doing that today. I'm assuming you all know Cinderella. If you don't, please watch the Disney movie and read some fairy tales. I don't know how you would get this far in life without knowing Cinderella. So I'm not gonna bother with all that. I am just going to be doing the book as a retelling, my thoughts, and some other reading recommendations. Please do note there will be spoilers for The Shadow in the Glass in this video. I'm going to try not to give everything away because there's quite a bit of shocking stuff in here, but in order to properly talk about it, there are several things that I need to discuss. So let's jump in. For this book, Harwood is mostly drawing on the very well-known version of Cinderella by Charles Perrault. It's the one with the glass slipper, the fairy godmother, the pumpkin carriage, etc. It's what Disney used. It's really the most well-known version. However, I would say tonally, she is drawing a lot more off of the Brothers Grimm variation of the story, which is called Ashpoodle, because that version is very gruesome. The stepsisters cut off their toes and their heels to try to fit their foot into the slipper, and at the end they get their eyes pecked out by birds. So yeah, not quite as nice and sweet as the French version. I say that she's drawing tonally off the Grimms, not because the stepsisters cutting off their toes and getting their eyes pecked out is in this book, because it's not, but because there are multiple grisly murders in this book. Like, it gets pretty brutal at times. It's not overly descriptive, but I would say that Harwood is leaning more into the dark side of fairy tales. I also think there's a possibility she is slightly drawing off the Italian version of the tale by, and I'm gonna butcher like everything that comes out of my mouth next, by Giambattista Basile. His version Cenerentola. Again, I think I just butchered all of that. In that version, the Cinderella character Zazola is very scheming. And I would say that Eleanor from Harwood's book leans more toward the scheming end of things than she does the sweet, innocent, kind, good, endlessly patient Cinderella of Perrault's fairy tale. So Eleanor was the ward of this family, the Pembrokes. She was taken in because she was the daughter of Mrs. Pembroke's servant, who she was very close to. And when she is taken in, she is initially raised as a daughter of the family. She is given dresses, a lovely bedroom. She is being raised to be a lady. She's educated. However, Mrs. Pembroke dies, and Mr. Pembroke relegates Eleanor to being a servant. Now, this is historical fiction. It is set in the Victorian era. So we have a lot of that kind of upstairs, downstairs, very rigid structure for the servants. Unfortunately, Mr. Pembroke is the worst person alive. He is lecherous and an alcoholic, and he sexually assaults his housemaids, and when they get pregnant, he dismisses them with no character reference. So Eleanor is trying to avoid that fate. She has seen friends go through it. She doesn't want it to happen to her. She's trying to avoid it happening to this younger housemaid called, and I'm probably going to mispronounce this too, it's an Irish name, Aoife, who is very young and sweet, and Eleanor doesn't want anything bad to happen to her. The house is in disrepair. Mr. Pembroke only spends money on his alcohol and his club fees. So things are not really great in the servants' quarters at this house. Eleanor is very unhappy. She dreams about becoming wealthy and getting away and becoming a lady like Mrs. Pembroke intended her to. So already we have a pretty big difference from the original fairy tale, because we have here a very kind stepmother figure who has passed away, and this absolutely horrific stepfather figure who is just awful. We do also get the stepsister's character later on when Charles Pembroke, the son of Mr. and Mrs. Pembroke, comes home with a fiancée named Felicity, and we will talk about her in a moment. Eleanor sneaks into the library to read at night, and one evening while reading Dr. Faustus, she summons a demon completely by accident. She's just reading out loud from the book, and she happens to get a paper cut and the blood plus the words. And this demon takes the form of a very kindly looking woman who could have been someone like Mrs. Pembroke or maybe even Eleanor's own mother, except she has eyes that are like black holes. So right away, Harwood is clearly exploring this idea of the fairy godmother and how it is frankly kind of sketchy. I personally love retellings that do this because it's so sketchy. In other versions of the fairy tale, it's like the spirit of Cinderella's dead mother that's providing her with things through the form of a bird or a tree. It's only in Perrault's that we just have this random fairy godmother appear out of nowhere. And Cinderella's just like, yeah, okay, that makes complete sense. When really, it's pretty sketchy. So I appreciate that Harwood is exploring that. This demon makes a deal with Eleanor. In exchange for her soul, she can have 7 wishes. And now Eleanor's like, I am dreaming or hallucinating, which is completely fair because the woman disappears and it's as if no one was sitting in the chair at all. She's like, nope, I am hallucinating. But before going to bed, she does wish for shoes the color of moonlight. So here are glass slippers. And when she wakes up in the morning, they're there. It's a pair of beautiful embroidered white and light blue shoes. We are aware very quickly that something's not quite right here because it turns out that the shoe shop in the area has been robbed. But that's like a very throwaway line. But you're like, Now knowing that the wishes are real, Eleanor is trying to plan out exactly how she's going to use them without using the 7th wish because she doesn't want to give up her soul. Unfortunately, she gets in a conflict with one of the other housemaids who has been bullying her and who threatens to kind of whisper in Mr. Pembroke's ear to ensure that Eleanor is the next one that he goes after. So Eleanor just says, I wish you would just stop. And it ends up counting as one of her wishes. And when she wakes up in the morning, this housemaid is dead, drowned in the water trough after being hit in the head with a coal bucket. Eleanor's pretty horrified by that, and we then find out that in order for these wishes to work, somebody has to die. And so, not wanting to kill people because that's awful, Eleanor's like, all right, I'm not going to use these wishes anymore. But there's always the temptation that's there. And as things get harder in her life, it becomes more tempting. Enter the stepsister character, Felicity. This is Charles's fiance. Eleanor has grown up with Charles. He went off to school after his mother died. He was not aware that his father made Eleanor into a servant. He's pretty upset by that. He's still very friendly to Eleanor. His fiancée, Felicity, is a beast of a person. Eleanor gets assigned as her lady's maid, and she is awful. She is abusive. She hits Eleanor. She pinches her, like, for even just talking to Charles, or for being too rough with the hairpins. It gets to a point where Eleanor's like, oh my God, he can't marry her. And now this is also, I think, something that Harwood draws from the Grimm version, because in the Grimm version, when the stepsisters cut off their feet and are like, look, the slipper fits, the prince takes them off on his horse and is going to marry them. The only reason that he doesn't is because with each one, some birds fly down and are like, look, there's blood in the shoe. So the idea of the prince character marrying or being about to marry one of the stepsister characters, I believe, comes from the Grimm version of the tale. Eleanor makes a wish that Charles will choose not to marry Felicity. So notice her wording. She's trying very hard to not have Felicity or Charles die. Of course, it does not work out quite how Eleanor wants, but Charles does break off the engagement. So the Felicity section is very short-lived. Eleanor is still disgusted with herself and horrified, doesn't want to use any more wishes. Yet, of course, things continue to get harder and harder. She and Charles begin an illicit affair that has some unintended consequences that Eleanor uses a wish to get out of. This also results in her being sent away to live in her own house. She tries to befriend some of Mrs. Pembroke's old friends to gain somebody who might give her some money. One of them dies after Eleanor wishes to be wealthy because she is getting so desperate to protect Aoife and to also find her friend Leah, who was dismissed because she was pregnant. So before Eleanor knows it, she has used 6 wishes. Mr. Pembroke is dead, murdered. But Charles comes back to her and they become engaged. She has money. She's free of Mr. Pembroke. However, there is this inspector who was originally investigating the death of the housemaid, but who also was looking into the death of the friend of Mrs. Pembroke that Eleanor had befriended, and the death of Mr. Pembroke. Eleanor is pretty jumpy by this point. And this is the point where we have the ball scene. It's right at the end. And the ball is some woman's ball, I forget who, some high society lady's ball. And Charles is going to announce his engagement to Eleanor there. It's going to be her first real foray into society. She's all dressed up. She's wearing her shoes the color of moonlight. And while they're there, the inspector comes and accuses her of murder of all of the people. The maid, the woman friend of Mrs. Pembroke, and Mr. Pembroke. So Eleanor is panicking. And she uses the last wish. She says she wishes to be above the law. At this point, the demon is like, well, your soul is mine. Eleanor doesn't want to give up her soul. So they make another deal. There's a churchyard near this house. And the demon says, so our deal will start at the first stroke of midnight. And if you can get to holy ground by the last stroke of midnight, you'll be free of our deal. And this begins basically the chase scene from the original fairy tale. Eleanor runs out at midnight. Charles runs after her. The inspector and several other members of the police are after her. She's racing against this demon godmother, trying to get to this churchyard. She leaves her shoes behind. She's desperate. When she gets to the churchyard, she realizes that the godmother has tricked her, because earlier we are told that they are digging up the churchyard to make room to put in something new. So yes, all of the bodies have been exhumed. All of the dirt has been taken out. There is no holy ground. So at that point, Eleanor just decides to charge at the godmother. And the result is them both disappearing. We don't really know what happened. The only thing left behind are her shoes. They search everywhere, they can't find her. And that is the end of the book. What did I think? I really enjoyed this. I gave it 4 stars. I really liked Eleanor as a character. Look, it's boring to have a sweet, good, perfect little Cinderella character. You need some personality. And Eleanor has that. And honestly, you want some flaws. And she is very flawed. So I really enjoyed that. I liked her. I felt for her and I was rooting for her, even though I kind of guessed right from the beginning, I was like, this doesn't have a happy ending. I really like the exploration of the godmother as the villain of the story, as I already said, because it's just such a sketchy thing. But I also like that there is a way to read this where it's actually all a product of Eleanor's imagination. So at the points of the murders, Eleanor actually loses time. She doesn't know what happened. She doesn't remember anything. She just goes to sleep. But it turns out that she is actually the one who kills all the people. So there is a reading of this where it is not actually magic, and it's just Eleanor going into some kind of state and doing the killings that will benefit her. And this is hinted at because we hear that in her childhood, when she first came to the house, she was an absolute terror, to the point where she actually scarred the housekeeper for life, but she doesn't remember any of it. So these points of her losing memory and being violent are established. So there is a way to read it like that, which I really liked. And I'm kind of on the fence about whether I think the demon was real or not, or whether it was just Ella's subconscious. But there is the fact that she disappeared at the end, so who knows? I like that it's left kind of open. I like that about a book. I did feel that certain things were a little over the top, particularly Felicity, who was an absolute beast. Oh my God. But I mean, she was kind of almost cartoonishly evil. There was some hints that like her family life was not that great, but it wasn't enough to raise her up from like cartoon villain to actual character. So I would have liked a little bit more of that. But overall, I really enjoyed it and I highly recommend it. So let's move into some other reading recommendations. So I have 3 other versions of Cinderella to talk about, and then another Gothic retelling of a fairy tale that I think is very similar in tone to The Shadow in the Glass. So for the first Cinderella retelling, I feel like I recommend this constantly. Confessions of an Ugly Stepsister by Gregory Maguire. This is historical fiction set in Amsterdam with, I forget what year too, but it's during the Tulip Fever. I just think if you like historical fiction versions of fairy tale retellings, this is like the one to go to. And I think somebody who enjoyed The Shadow in the Glass would definitely enjoy this. There are no magic elements at all in here, but we do have a very complex Cinderella character who is not the good, sweet darling that comes from the original fairy tale. It is from the perspective of one of the stepsisters. Her name is Iris. And it's so good. It's beautiful. In a similar vein is All the Ever Afters by Danielle Teller. This is from the perspective of the stepmother character. It is also historical fiction set in medieval England. And again, it has such complex characters. The Cinderella character is very complicated. She's actually coded as having autism, I believe. Stepmother character Agnes is just such a well-drawn character and so sympathetic but also flawed, which is just something I love. And as in Confessions of an Ugly Stepsister, there is no magic in this one. I think the reason that those two would be so good for people who enjoy The Shadow in the Glass, not only because they're historical fiction, but they also all deal with this issue of class. Eleanor is a servant, and she is trying to break through and become a lady. It's all about how wealth plays a role, how social position, and Confessions of an Ugly Stepsister and All the Ever Afters both really look at that as well. This next one that I'm going to recommend is very different tonally than The Shadow in the Glass, but they are doing one thing the same, and that's why I want to mention it. This is Princess of Glass by Jessica Day George. This is a young adult retelling. It's actually the second in a series. The first one is The Princess of the Midnight Ball, which is a retelling of the 12 Dancing Princesses. And the reason I recommend this, even though it is tonally like on the opposite end, is because this also casts the fairy godmother as a sketchy character and is exploring that, which I just think is so interesting because it's sketchy. In the original fairy tale, it's weird and nobody ever addresses it. So I enjoy books that address it. So I think if you're looking for something that addresses that idea, but is much more lighter in tone and easier to read and not so violent, Princess of Glass is a great place to go. And now for the one non-Cinderella retelling I have here that is very similar tonally to The Shadow in the Glass is Juniper and Thorn by Ava Reed. This is a retelling of the fairy tale The Juniper Tree, which is already a really gruesome fairy tale, and somehow Reed manages to make it even more gruesome. This deals with a lot of similar themes, including sexual assault, and it is gothic, it is gory. The gore is higher here than in Shadow in the Glass, but there are some pretty grisly deaths, and I think that somebody who likes The Shadow in the Glass would really enjoy Juniper and Thorn, and vice versa. So that is my Fairy Tale Friday on The Shadow in the Glass. Let me know down in the comments below. Have you read this book? Are you thinking about it? What is your favorite Cinderella retelling? It has been great chatting with you. I will see you soon. Bye.